Hello, my name is Michael. I'm a composer and music educator, and today I want to show you one of my favorite pieces of music, the Anthology of Fantastic Zoology by the composer Mason Bates. So with this ongoing series of videos, I want to open up some of my favorite pieces of music, classical and otherwise, looking at the notes on the page and trying to get a deeper understanding of the meaning that is hidden within these pieces. Hopefully this series of videos can be useful to you, can at the very least show you some pieces of music that you might not have heard before. Or maybe it can give you a deeper sense of understanding of classical music, which is so often considered a hidden discipline for only the elite or the educated. The inaugural episode of this series is dedicated to a modern classical piece by the composer Mason Bates. Mason Bates is often touted as one of the most performed composers of his generation. He's written operas and symphonies and pieces that incorporate elements of DJing and electronic music. But today we're going to be focusing on one of his orchestral symphonies called the Anthology of Fantastic Zoology. It was commissioned by the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and was premiered in 2015. And it is based on a book by an Argentine author named Jorge Luis Borges. Borges is known for his imaginative writing, for his short stories, and for his poetry. But the Anthology of Fantastic Zoology, which he published in 1957, is actually an encyclopedia of mythical creatures. From different folk traditions and different cultures, he gathered hundreds of creatures and wrote little imaginative paragraphs underneath about their stories, their backstories, and their folklore. It really does read like a field manual to these mythical creatures, as if you're going to see them around the next corner. He structures this piece of music like a ballet, placing the listener in the opening setting of the forest at twilight. From the very first measures of this piece, you can tell that you are in a fantastical, magical world. There's 11 movements in this piece, 5 of which are dedicated to the passage of time, and 6 of which are dedicated to showcasing various mythical creatures. All in all, this piece comes to about 30 minutes in length. It immediately grabs the listener. It definitely feels at times like a film score because of how gestural and how imaginative it is. And so I think this will be a really, really easy piece of music for you to listen to, even if you just put it on in the background. This is one of my favorite pieces of music, and so I could talk about it for hours. And so I want to focus on 3 main areas of discussion. Like I said earlier, from those first measures, you can tell that this is fantasy. You can feel that this is a fairy tale. And I want to look at how he does that musically. Second, I want to look at how he writes the passage of night into the music. The darkness gets darker and the light fades from the horizon as the forest comes alive with creatures. And that all happens in the music. And lastly, I want to focus in on some of the creatures that he writes into this piece. Sprites bouncing around the concert hall, and the Gryphon that comes and devours the strings. And so I want to look at the creative choices that Mason Bates uses to conjure these creatures in the concert hall. So to start, I want to look at the way that Mason Bates takes the orchestra and turns it into a machine of fantasy and imagination. Listeners have become accustomed to associate certain musical techniques with certain non-musical story elements or phenomena. Some of these associations are culturally rooted, so they might be a Western cultural association that might not necessarily carry over to non-Western contexts. Now, for example, the chromatic notes in Jaws. If you've seen that movie, if you've had that cultural experience, or even if you've grown up in the United States or in Europe in a place where that has become almost like a meme, a cultural phenomenon, you associate those 2 low chromatic notes with a shark in the water coming to get you. The music in and of itself might not necessarily indicate that there's a shark in the water, but you've grown to associate that with a shark in the water because of your cultural context and experiences. Now, some of these associations go beyond the cultural and are literally physically bound. For example, wind instruments such as the flute or the oboe or even the trumpet, because they are made by the performer blowing air through the instrument, they are much more adept at depicting breath or depicting flight or wind or air than, say, a percussion instrument, which is hit. So oftentimes in a movie, when you're following a bird through a scene or a butterfly, a great example of this is The Prisoner of Azkaban. That scene is accompanied by a flute, which is a wind instrument, which is very airy, light, and agile. Now, those characteristics of that instrument lend themselves to flying creatures. And lastly, some of these associations are literally physiological. The way that the sound hits your body impacts you in a certain way. Now, a good example of this is when you're in a movie theater and you feel the bass of huge, low basses, low brass, or even synthetic elements that are super low and bassy. You can't help but imagine that something large is moving. Anthology of Fantastic Zoology brilliantly employs all of these techniques to paint a picture of fantasy and imaginative creatures. One of the first ways that Mason Bates does this is through his percussion section. Now, the percussion section includes anything that is hit, whether it be a drum or a xylophone or even a piano, which technically is considered a percussion instrument because the hammers on the inside of the piano hit the strings. Now, through this percussion section, he really paints the picture of fantasy. He chooses certain instruments which we have grown to associate with fantasy and with light-hearted, sprightly music. For example, the glockenspiel. Glockenspiel are also called orchestral bells. We often associate them with fantasy and with flight. Another good example of that ethereal sound is crotales. Crotales are circular pieces of metal that really ring a long time. Sometimes they're bowed to make the unsettling ringing that you hear in horror movies. And sometimes they're just played to make it sound really airy and magical. Now, Mason Bates also writes for woodblocks. When I hear the woodblocks, I can't help but think of the forest. I think of a woodpecker pecking on a tree, that rattling sound reverberating through the massive trunks of a giant old-growth forest. It also helps that woodblocks are literally just pieces of wood that are being hit by mallets. So that woody sound definitely conveys that we are in some kind of fairy tale forest. Now, moving on to the woodwind section, Mason Bates writes for a very standard woodwind section: 3 flutes, 3 oboes, 3 clarinets, 2 bassoons and 1 contrabassoon, and of course, flutes doubling on piccolo and English horn and all the other standard doublings. Woodwinds are very agile, they're versatile, and they add a lot of the fantasy feel. The first thing you're going to notice when you listen to this piece is the woodwinds as they play a fantastic run leading into trills that are sustained for measures. This is very traditional woodwind writing. Woodwinds adding the frill and motion on top of the orchestral texture. He chooses certain woodwinds later on in the piece to embody some of these creatures. For example, he chooses flute to portray the sprites. The little fairies bouncing around the concert hall are portrayed by the flutes. He chooses clarinet to portray the nymphs. He writes for the bassoon later to play notes that are bent, sounding very ancient and mysterious when the night gets darker. And lastly, Mason Bates writes string effects and extended techniques to really make this piece feel otherworldly and unique. For example, in the second movement, entitled Sprite, the high strings, violin 1 and violin 2, are told to play a glissando. Now, a glissando involves moving your fingers from one note, moving it very, very slowly up to the next note. Now, this technique sounds like a film score. That moment is so magical because you don't notice it's happening at first, and subconsciously you start to feel the tension as if the floor is dropped out from under you. Another string technique he uses is clusters, writing notes very close together. As opposed to a chord that is spaced out, he writes them very, very close together, like this. We'll take a look at this later on as we look at the first movement, Twilight, and see how he uses those swelling clusters to conjure up the fear and mystery of night. Now, all of these fantasy elements, along with others I didn't have time to mention, play a part in Mason Bates' depiction of this fantasy world, of the forest slipping deeper and deeper into a magical night. One of the main things that inspired me to make this video was seeing how Mason Bates writes the passage of night into the piece. The first time I listened, I didn't hear it, but I felt it. I noticed, oh, we're going to a darker place here. We are in a more mysterious place here. But when I opened up the score, I actually saw how he was writing this into the music. Now, as I mentioned before, 5 of the movements in this piece are dedicated to depicting the evolution of the forest through different stages of night. 4 of these are what we would call intermezzos or interludes. Twilight, Dusk, Night, and Midnight are their titles. They're short pieces, less than a minute each. They simply set the stage for where we are in the night before showing us a specific creature. And of course, the 5th movement is a finale. It's entitled Madrugada, which is a Spanish word for the time between midnight and dawn, or the witching hours, you might say. Now, this is the place where all of the creatures come back together to have their own little cameo in this large finale movement. Through the notes written on the page, you can actually hear the light disappearing, the shadows growing darker, and creatures moving around in the dark. These 4 movements are sort of like a theme and variations. Twilight, the first movement, is the theme, or the pattern that the other movements will displace or modify to show the night getting darker. The first movement is Twilight, which is the brightest of the stages of night, and of course it is the brightest piece. It's even given the expressive marking chiaroscuro, which is referencing the Renaissance painting technique of painting very high contrast between dark shadows and light highlights. This is what he's doing with the music. The light is played by the woodwinds and high strings. I imagine the afterglow after the sun has disappeared behind the horizon. You still see a bit of that sunset. That is the strings and the woodwinds. It opens with this beautiful run that culminates in these tremolo chords. Now these woodwind runs end up landing on these trills, the trilled notes of D flat and E flat, which lie within the tonal center of a sort of E flat 7 kind of situation, right here. And then you also have the dissonance of C and D natural. And although that might sound a little off to you, it bears mentioning that this piece is not functionally harmonic. The harmonies and notes that Mason Bates chooses are not meant to follow the rules of Bach to Brahms tonal harmony, as much as they are choices to evoke certain visual and story elements. This dissonance, although it sounds a little bit off on the piano, when played in the woodwinds and accompanied by other musical parts, proves to be very bright, just like the light that it is meant to evoke. Fluttered horns fill in the gaps, adding these elements of humor. Although the tonal center for these measures seems to be something like E7, and we have that dissonance in the woodwinds, we also get these very interesting F sharp, B, F sharp, B runs, like that. It sounds to me like a bird is poking its head into the frame and then disappearing quite quickly. Now the dark is played by the low woodwinds and low strings, which are playing very dissonant clusters. For example, at measure 4, we start to hear the swelling of cellos and basses, and we get this very dissonant cluster of low notes where we have B, C sharp, F9, natural, F sharp, B, and D natural, all played together. And although it sounds very dissonant on the piano, in the strings and the basses and the bassoons, it sounds very much like something really big is moving just beyond what you can see. You can see the shadow moving, but you can't really see what's behind the shadow. And then finally we reach this cadence point towards the end of this movement. The tension really builds as we get these three chords. So we start off with an A13 kind of chord, which all of a sudden brings this tonal clarity. We've been in such a dissonant world, and all of a sudden we get this beautiful chord. But it doesn't last for long as we move to a very mysterious chord, something built out of F minor, D, and A natural. But then we get a resolution on a B13 chord that swells into the next movement. Now, that resolution point, what those chords end up going to, will tell us where we are in the night, as well as how much light is present, how much dark is present. All right, now we have the template. How does Mason Bates change that template to show us how far the night has progressed? Movement 3 is entitled Dusk. So this piece is very similar to Twilight, but you'll notice right away that the woodwind trills and runs are not as present and don't play as much of a part. We actually see Mason Bates has removed oboes from the run, shortened that run by 2/3. He's taken out 2 of the sextuplets. Now it's only 1 sextuplet run. Leading up to that trill. The woodblock you hear right away sets the tone for this feeling different than Twilight. And as I mentioned before, that cadence that happens at the end of each of these night pieces will show us where we are in the night. Now, this time it resolves to a different chord. Instead of the piece ending like this, setting a certain tone, the piece ends like this. And you'll notice that the chord is mostly the same, but the change of those bass notes can completely change the context and what you hear in the chord. In night, even less frill. We don't even have the sextuplet runs. We just have a set of 3 or 4 grace notes. We still don't have the oboe, and we have a very, very different sounding piece immediately. Woodblock is still present, making it feel very mysterious. In fact, the expressive marking here is misterioso, which of course means mysterious. In night, you'll hear that bassoon bend that I was talking about earlier. Bassoon in classical music has often portrayed mystical and magical subjects. If you think about pieces like The Sorcerer's Apprentice, if you think about The Rite of Spring, the bassoon is a magical, magical instrument and sounds out of this world. That bassoon is such an important move in showing us that the night, in all of its mystery and danger and intrigue, is now fully present. And moving to the cadence, we see that it's much quicker. There's not as much time spent on each chord. It moves much more quickly. Now the resolution point becomes this E9 chord. And although that chord might feel a little bit more pleasant than that dissonant G natural under B13, it's actually quite a bit darker. I don't know if you can hear that. For one thing, the string notes are written lower. They're not playing up here, they're playing down here. So if Twilight is something like this, we end up in some place that is much, much brighter. It's very subtle, but that movement from that odd-sounding F minor with D and A natural on top to B opens up, and from this to E closes a little bit. It's less open, it's a little bit more like a plagal cadence, which in classical music is considered to be a darker cadence. So finally we arrive at midnight, which is the last of the short interludes marking the passage of time. Of course, the last one is more of a finale where everybody is playing their own part and coming into the scene. At midnight, there are no woodwind runs leading up to the beginning measure. It is the quietest dynamic marking given for the beginning of one of these interludes. So you can see we have the horns triple P and we have the low woodwinds. We don't even have flutes, we just have clarinets playing a very, very low trill. Woodblock, of course, is present, but it is much lighter and less evident than the other moments in the piece. We do still have these little poking moments of flute and even oboe having these dissonant spikes. And then we have these undulating string clusters. Very dense harmony, and if you'll notice, the violins are split up into so many distinct parts that it looks like its own full orchestral score. Lots and lots of different notes being played ever so slightly different, giving this very unsettling, wavy texture. And as you would assume, the darkest stage of night thus far is going to be the darkest cadence and the least final resolution. And that final chord of the cadence, the arrival point, is very not final. It is very dissonant. We have our E flat minor triad over a low E natural in the lower strings. So when we get to this point, it is very dark, it is very thick in the orchestral texture, and it is very much so late in the night. And so you can see that Mason Bates has written excellently this passage of time through the music, starting with these elaborate, energetic string and woodwind runs and trills, and then slowly taking those out and replacing them with dark, undulating textures of clustered, close, dissonant harmonies. And now I think we've set the table really well to look at how Mason Bates portrays specific fantastic creatures. He chooses 6 kinds of creatures to focus on throughout this piece: sprites, the A Bao A Qu, the Nymphs, Gryphon, Sirens, and the Zaratan. So we're going to take a look at each one individually to see how he musically portrays them. Sprites are from European mythology and Celtic mythology. They are often portrayed as supernatural, fairy-like creatures that fly around with little wings through the forest. Mason Bates portrays the sprites starting off with the flute playing a very light dancing line. You can hear those wood blocks playing their part to make this feel like a fantastical forest scene. And one of the main features of this piece is this very short 4-note motif. It sounds like this. You first hear it in the flute, and then it goes immediately to the clarinet. And then eventually, as the piece gets more developed, that little 4-note motif, in some form or another, is passed to each stand of the orchestra. It goes down to the strings, to violin 1, violin 2, viola, starting with individual stands. A stand is where two players are sharing a piece of music. So you'll have a stand partner, and usually it's just two of you, and so it's going one stand at a time, very individual players as it dances around the orchestra. The effect is very much like a dance, as if an invisible sprite is taking control of individual players, making them play that four-note motif. Moving on out of the twilight into the dusk, we come into contact with a lesser-known beast, the A Bao A Qu, which is said to be of Malaysian origin. Of course, it really doesn't appear too many other places outside of fantastic zoology. One of my favorite parts about this piece is that it's a palindrome. So just as something like Taco Cat is the same phrase spelled backwards and forwards, this entire piece revolves around a central point from which the piece can be read either forwards or backwards, and it reads the exact same. But one of the things that makes this stand out is how he even takes some of those elements of electronic music and puts them into the physical orchestra. The piece starts with a hit on the tam-tam. It's a large gong. At the very end, you'll notice, since this is a palindrome, you wonder how a gong being hit would be played backwards. And if you take that into a digital audio workstation and reverse the waveform, it would sound something like this. Mason Bates emulates this by having the performer of the tam-tam part swell the tam-tam with mallets and choking it at the very end to emulate that very effect of reversing the waveform. Now, there's a lot of the background of the myth written into this piece. According to the myth, the A Bao A Qu is an almost translucent serpent that is in a state of suspended animation at the bottom of this tower called the Victory Tower. And when a pilgrim walks up the tower, up the spiral staircase, the snake is enlivened and follows it. And as it gets higher and higher on the staircase, it gets more and more colorful, more and more animate, and more alive. Now, a pilgrim is said to only be able to ascend to the top of the tower if they are enlightened. And so oftentimes they'll have to turn back, and when they do, the snake follows right behind them, tumbling down the stairs. So this happens in the music. The reason that it is a palindrome, of course, is to emulate that ascent of the snake and descent of the snake just in the exact same order. Now, Borges writes about the A Bao A Qu that when it ends up falling down the stairs, before it does so, it makes a little scream that sounds like the rustling of silk. Mason Bates accomplishes this by using a ratchet and a soprano wind machine to create this kind of sound. And from there, the piece reverses over itself all the way back to the beginning. What struck me is how color gets added to the orchestra as the snake ascends the stairs, and as it descends, that color is also sucked out. The harmonies at bar 62 in the strings are stunning, sounding a lot like modern jazz. And they grow most intense towards the end of the ascent and the beginning of the descent of the palindrome. I think it's just one of the most ingenious movements of this piece, to write a piece of music that reads the same forwards and backwards, to have the reverse of the tam hit, and to even have that rustling of silk with a percussion instrument like a wind machine. Now moving on to nymphs. Nymphs are a feature of ancient Greek mythology, often portrayed as divine maidens, personifications of nature. Now the musical movements, Nymphs is a clarinet duet between the first and second clarinet. Both are instructed to play their music in a liquid manner, so it definitely conjures the image of nymphs bathing or playing in a body of water. An amazing detail that I noticed was that the harp plays certain notes, and immediately after that note, the viola will play their instrument in the method of ricochet, which involves bouncing the bow on the strings. When they're put together, it makes them sound almost like one instrument, and it adds to that playful, fluid, liquid sound of the piece. Now this piece is written in a very polytonal way, sort of straddling the tonalities of E flat major and B flat major. At the same time, it has a lot of F major and G major chords thrown in there. When you play them all together, it sounds very otherworldly and heavenly almost. Viola's playing these C's and F's to have the A's represented, and then to all of a sudden have bass pizzicato playing E flat and B flat together. Just disorienting enough, but in a fluid way that makes you feel like you're in some other world. I think a great example of this wispy, fluid-like playing in the clarinets and then these beautiful, heart-wrenching harmonies in the strings is from bar 59 to 66. And that brings us to night, where the first character we see emerging from the shadows is the Gryphon. The Gryphon appears in Greek mythology, Roman mythology. It is said to have the head and wings of an eagle and the body and back legs of a lion, uniting two incredibly regal and powerful creatures in one, the king of the skies and the king of the land, together in one creature. Now later in the 7th century AD, the Gryphon started to be associated with being the sworn enemy of horses, said to prey upon horses, swooping down on them and taking them from their pasture. And that is exactly what Mason Bates portrays with this piece. The violins represent horses that are galloping away from the Gryphon, which is conjured by the horns and timpani. Right away from the very beginning of this piece, you can hear the violins carrying the rhythm, playing short staccato notes that continue in a galloping fashion. And the Gryphon appears officially at bar 36 with the motif that represents the Gryphon throughout the rest of the piece. These three notes. Now, when put together with the full horns, it has the effect of a very regal but very frightening beast swooping in on these horses. And as the Gryphon swoops down, you'll start to hear the violins gallop. The rhythm at bar 86 sounds like a horse galloping away, like many Western film scores. And one by one, those galloping strings are devoured by the horns. It's actually one of my favorite expressive markings in a score of music. As you see, the horns are actually told to devour the violins. And one by one, the violins are picked off by the horns as the stands are told to play just one player per stand, and then eventually no players remain. It's one of the most dynamic examples of portraying a story or folk tale through the technique of writing. After midnight arrives, we are introduced to the Sirens. Sirens appear in Greek mythology, most famously in Homer's Odyssey. They're female, human-like, with alluring voices that attempt to get sailors out of their boats and into the water where they can then be drowned. Bates takes a different turn with this piece, focusing a little bit more on the sweet singing voices of the Sirens, which are represented by the two offstage violins. This piece has such a magical feel. Together we have this alternation of woodwind trill and these beautiful bell instruments, the vibraphone. It feels like pure magic. Then when the violins come in, they start to lure your ear to the right off stage to where you can't see a player, but you can hear a beautiful singing melody. Through the course of this piece, one by one, those offstage violins lure their other string counterparts to join them in an ecstatic climax. And that ecstatic climax is represented by a very interesting piece of harmony. It's a D-flat Lydian cluster. So D-flat Lydian is a mode of music that sounds very dreamlike on its own. It sounds like this. And when all of the orchestral parts are playing that together, all of those strings are playing together, it sounds quite magical. But this leads into the final movement depicting a creature, which is the Zaratan. Now, the Zaratan comes from Arabic folklore. It is a massive creature that lives in the ocean and has a shell so large and so wide that soil gathers on it, plants and trees grow, and it looks like an island. Originally, the word Zaratan means crab, and so it was meant to portray a giant crab in the middle of the ocean. But when Borges put it in his book, he made it a turtle, and that is often how it's remembered nowadays, much like the lion turtles from Avatar: The Last Airbender. Sailors are said to have landed on its back and seen it as dry land, and after making their camps, the turtle makes a dive and they all drown. So how does Bates portray this through music? Well, to start, he moves us from that beautiful, lush D-flat Lydian cluster into a stark set of A-flat octaves. Then one by one, each part starts to move chromatically, moving notes just next to it until eventually we are left with this incredibly dissonant and dark cluster. Each part moves incredibly slow and with glissando so that even the notes in between the note that we wouldn't necessarily represent with sheet music are played. The effect of the island sinking into the ocean, into the depths, and taking everybody with it. It sounds incredibly intense on recording, and it must sound even more intense in person as the sound swells around you and makes you feel like you're sinking. And as the Zaratan dives deep into the ocean, bringing all the sailors with it, we are brought to our final movement of this piece, Madrugada. As I said before, Madrugada means the witching hour. It means the time before midnight and dawn. And so this is the moment where all the creatures are meeting and intermingling. It's like a finale at the end of an opera act where all the characters are making their little appearance and melding their parts with everybody else's. My challenge to you at this point is to pause the video, listen to the finale, and see how many aspects of the other movements that came before show up. How many creatures can you identify? No piece can be complete without a brilliant ending, and Mason Bates chooses to end this piece in a uncharacteristically simple way with just C's all across the orchestra. So there are a few little details about this lovely piece of music by Mason Bates. I highly encourage you to go listen to it. It's only about 30 minutes long, so listen to the whole thing and start thinking about how these characters are appearing and playing through the musical notes. And lastly, if you have any suggestions of pieces I should look at in the future or any questions about this piece, please let me know in the comment section below. I would really appreciate your feedback as well as your questions. I love to be able to answer those questions, and I'll do the best job I can. Thank you for watching this video, and please join me in the next episode of Music Ed where we open up another score.